future. Let me turn this over.
Just hit publish on there, so it should be working.
Come here, it's not even giving me the option to do that.
Okay, now it should be. Refresh again. Okay, we're good. Good? Yeah, refresh again.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Gary, and I'm an assistant professor in the Department of English and Africana Studies here at Davidson College. It's a great pleasure to be here and to be able to introduce our keynote speaker, Marisa Fuentes, who is the Presidential Term Chair in African American History and Associate Professor of Women's and Gender Studies and History at Rutgers University in New Brunswick. But before I introduce Professor Fuentes, I need to pause only briefly here to thank you, all of you, for joining us over the past couple of days and for taking part in this important symposium on slavery violence in the archive. And I'd also like to thank all of our esteemed, sorry, I ran over here. And I'd also like to thank all of our esteemed panelists for their generous and generative presentations and conversation. So a special thanks to Professors Etta Fields-Black, Matthew Morrison, Edley Wong, Neil Roberts, Marty Crabtree, Hillary Green, and to John Franklin. I would also like to give a special shout out to my current major and honors thesis advisees, all of whom I hope are in attendance, and all of whom are extraordinary thinkers in their own right. Indeed, their thoughtfulness in our discussions and debates have revealed beautiful and brilliant minds that are profoundly imaginative and methods that are deeply inspired. So special thanks to Gabby, Naomi, Maurice, Jennifer, Victor Allen, Margot, SJ, Phoebe, Ellie, Thomas, Alexa, and Jade. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me into your worlds and for sharing your gifts with me and with all of us. When I sat down last night to write this introduction, I thought about my own experience in and with Davidson's own archive, which is, as we know, an archive intimately bound up with the complex and unthinkable and perhaps even ineffable histories and afterlives of chattel slavery, racial capitalism, and settler colonialism. Histories and afterlives which continue to animate and haunt the modern world. And I think I'd be remiss here if I did not share with you some of my preliminary findings. According to the United States Federal Census of Slave Schedules from 1850, Adam Brevard Davidson, who seems to have been the planter, whose sawmills provided the lumber with which this college was built. So Adam Brevard Davidson owned a total of 26 slaves. In Mecklenburg County alone, the Davidsons altogether owned 237 slaves. To give you some perspective, there are exactly 150 seats in this hall. According to the United States Federal Census of Slave Schedules from 1860, Davidson owned a total of 37 slaves, while in Mecklenburg County alone, the Davidsons altogether owned 194 slaves. The Davidsons were, of course, one of the wealthiest and largest slaveholding families in all of Mecklenburg County. According to these same schedules, moreover, Thomas W. Sparrow, after whom the so-called Sparrow's Nest is named, so Thomas W. Sparrow owned 11 slaves and 9 slaves, respectively. And the following excerpt is from an article published in the Davidsonian from 1961. And here the Davidsonian is worth quoting at length. Quote, "This little house, which stands next to the college laundry, was built before the Civil War to house servants for the Sparrow's Nest. A certain Mr. Sparrow, one of the prominent citizens of early Davidson, Thomas Sparrow, a local merchant and brother of First Faculty Patrick Sparrow, had built his home on the lot next to the present site of Richardson Dorm. He had 4 attractive daughters who managed to charm a goodly portion of the nearby student body. In time, things got so cozy that the place was fondly spoken of as the Sparrow's Nest, end quote. I haven't been able to find much on Sparrow's daughters, though I will say that according to the 1850 census, the enslaved women living at the so-called Sparrow's Nest were, again at least according to the 1850 census, listed as mulattoes. I'll let that sit with you. I should also mention that among the antebellum laws enacted by North Carolina's General Assembly was, quote, an act to prevent the sale of intoxicating liquors at or near Davidson College, end quote. This same act also specifically prohibited billiards and theatrical exhibitions, serenade or performance in music, dancing, or singing. Free persons of color found guilty of this misdemeanor were, quote, whipped at the public whipping post on the bare back, not exceeding 39 lashes, end quote, while convicted slaves were ordered, quote, to receive 39 lashes on his or her bare back, end quote. And just in case you were wondering, or near seems to have meant within a 3-mile radius of the college. Of course, I am reminded here of the 5th chapter to Saidiya Hartman's Scenes of Subjection, and particularly to her discussion of how the exercise of free will, quite literally, was inextricable from guilty infractions, criminal misdeeds, punishable transgressions, and what she herself describes as, quote, an elaborate micro-penality of everyday life, end quote. In similar fashion to Hartman and to Michelle Rove-Trio, Professor Fuentes is invested in the Africana project of unsilencing, as Professor Benson put it in her introductory remarks last night. In the 18th century, Bridgetown, Barbados was heavily populated by both enslaved and free women. In her book, titled Dispossessed Lives, Enslaved Women, Violence in the Archive, Professor Fuentes writes about urban Caribbean slavery in Bridgetown from the perspective of these women, whose stories appear only briefly in historical records. And in this brave and beautiful and brilliant book, Professor Fuentes introduces her readers to the streets of Bridgetown, with an enslaved runaway, inside a brothel run by a free woman of color, in the midst of a white urban household in sexual chaos, to the gallows where enslaved people were executed, and within violent scenes of enslaved women's punishments. By interrogating the archive and its historical production then, Professor Fuentes exposes the ongoing effects of white colonial power that have limited and continue to constrain what can be known about these women. In doing so, therefore, Professor Fuentes challenges the way we write histories of vulnerable, precarious, and often invisible, erased, banalized, and disavowed subjects. Her book, which was published by the University of Pennsylvania Press in 2016, has received several prestigious honors and awards, including the Barbara T. Christian Prize from the Caribbean Studies Association, the First Book Prize from the Berkshire Conference of Women Historians, and the Letitia Woods Brown Memorial Book Award from the Association of Black Women Historians. We are so very lucky to have her here, and I'm excited to learn more about her work in progress, some of which will be presented this afternoon. The title of her keynote address is Refuse Bodies, Disposable Lives, A History of the Human in the Transatlantic Slave Trade. So please join me in welcoming our keynote speaker, Professor Rove.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
Thank you all so much for sticking around on a Saturday afternoon. After what has been a really powerful and generative series of presentations by my colleagues, you all should be incredibly proud of the work that you all have done to put this together, to get us to think about legacies of slavery and the violence of the afterlife of slavery. So I'd like to begin to add my gratitude to the chorus of thanks to the sentiments already expressed by my colleagues. I am profoundly honored to be here and so grateful for Professor Berthoff, where did you go? Oh, there you are. For extending the invitation to me to give the keynote. It is among my most esteemed colleagues that I humbly do so. Thank you to Professor Spence Benson, the Africana Studies Department, and the History Department for helping to host all of us, to the Davidson College Commission on Race and Slavery, and Vice President for Academic Affairs and Dean Wendy Raymond for the support of this incredibly wonderful and enriching program. I also offer thanks to the students who have not only given, I was overhearing your amazing presentations, but also just being around to assist us getting to and fro. I appreciate and recognize your labor. And finally, a profound thanks to Meg Sawicki, who arranged our travel and accommodations. Thank you all so very much. I'm going to turn this on. Hopefully it works. Before I delve into my formal remarks, I want to provide some background as well as set out the stakes of this very new project that I'm working on refugee slaves. And I emphasize and beg your indulgence on the newness of this project. My first book, Dispossessed Lives, put forth the argument that we must persist in historical work on subjects despite their empirical limitations. Subjects who were either invisible or fragmented in the archive and often shown through spectacular forms of violence. It was a methodological project that demonstrated how we might still engage in historical production, but with an ethics of disrupting power in language, representation, narrative form, and legal structures. It was my hope that the book offered a way to rethink our approach to traditional archival sources and to historicize vulnerable historical subjects that had been previously neglected. My next book project continues in this effort of finding meaning in historical lives most overlooked, or where the archive or historical actor yields hardly a story or even a name. This new work makes broader interventions into philosophy, historiographies of slavery, the slave trade and capitalism, and the fields of gender and cultural studies to most simply write a history of the discarded captives of the Atlantic slave trade. But in a more theoretical frame, I aim to articulate the contours and limits of humanity in the condition of these so-called refugee slaves. I want to challenge the accounts of the slave trade that rely on the abstract and aggregated accounting of traders and to expose how nameless, anonymous subjects fall out of our view because there seems to be nothing more to say about people who appear in the archives only briefly and in mortal danger. This work will analyze how 20th century history has framed our understanding of atrocities committed against humans and reveals how race and disposability were linked historically with particular attention to the origins or the original moments of their imbrication, that is, race and disposability. The larger project from which this talk is drawn is also an intervention in philosophies of the human from Hegel to Alexander Wehelier, Hortense Spillers, and Sylvia Wynter. These latter two scholars will be critical for the book, but for the sake of time, for this talk, I will think with Wehelier in his 2014 book, Habeas Viscus. Like him, I'm interested in interrogating the 20th century philosophical understandings of biopolitics, state power, and the racialization of humans, but I center the slave trade and the people destroyed by it as my points of departure, instead of more contemporary moments and popular culture. Theoretical meditations on the human in relationship to the African diaspora often occur in cultural and philosophical studies where slavery and the Middle Passage stand as symbols for the condition of blackness and non-humanity. My intention to contend with the archives of the slave trade is to ground these philosophical considerations of blackness and non-humanity in the materiality of accounting, trading, and the processes of discarding black bodies. In this analysis, while attempting to illuminate actual people who experienced firsthand the mortal consequences of early modern capitalism, I demonstrate not only the profound dehumanization they faced and the violent calculations embedded in the refuse category, but also direct historical attention beyond capitalist configurations to dwell on, insist on, a meditation of their experiences in their final moments. I should also add that I too am not an Afro-pessimist, but I am very much interested in elaborating on the condition of people who fall out of these stories. So the following talk will introduce how the category of refuse slaves presents itself and is rendered negligible in the archives of slavery and the histories we produce about them. And I'll move through a few theoretical formulations most common to thinking about the enslaved condition, but as yet fall short of a precise understanding of the full spectrum of unfreedom and precarity captive Africans faced. I hope to reveal how racial precarity and capitalism emerged simultaneously in the early modern Atlantic world. I also hope to do justice to my colleagues' work that has been presented here, and that the themes I raise in this talk will resonate with the conversations we've been having for the past 2 days to think again about commemoration, memory, and trauma, archival disavowal and silence, wake work and redress. To begin again, Jamestown, Virginia, June 25th, 1679, a letter to England, quote, "We received orders from Mr. Thomas Thurton to take into our care the refuse Negroes for the Royal Africa Company and dispose of them for the best we can. They were 14 in number, some of them so old, others so infirm, that it is a shame that such Negroes should be shipped in aboard, which serve only to annoy and destroy them of better value. There are 2 of them dead, and 2 we believe will not live long." Barbados, May 8, 1709, another report to investors, quote, "11 they buried during the sale," end quote. Montserrat, April 26, 1712, quote, "50 Negroes from Barbados, which proved very ordinary. 7 died before sold any, and several since." Antigua, June 15th, 1714. Mr. Edward Chester Sr. writes that, quote, "The 8 slaves that the bill of mortality do not make out were left on board the ship, not being able to come over the side, the most of which are since dead, and the whole will not make out 40 pounds. On May 26, 1676, the slave ship James anchored in Carlisle Bay, the main port of Bridgetown, Barbados, after a voyage of over 10 weeks across the Atlantic from the Gold Coast. When the first day of sail commenced, on Thursday, May 25th, the agents of the Royal Africa Company in Bridgetown, Mr. Steed and Mr. Gascoigne, sold 163 of the captives on board. By Saturday, May 27th, they sold 118 more. Trying to empty his ship of captives and complete his obligations to the stakeholders of the voyage, the captain of the James, Peter Blake, wrote, quote, "Tuesday, the 30th. This day I went on board with a planter to sell him some of the refuse slaves, but he did not like them. But the next day he, quote, sold 5 of the refuse slaves." A disembarkation of African captives in Bridgetown, which began with 372 survivors of the Middle Passage, ended in Bridgetown with one notation. On Tuesday, June 6th, Captain Blake recorded that while his crew agreed to sail on to Nevis with 223 additional captives from another ship that arrived from the Bight of Biafra, quote, "Mr. Gascoigne fetched ashore the remaining slaves from the James, being 7 men and 10 women. European planters and traders complained that the captives from Biafra were weak and sickly. They thus quickly became the victims of transshipment to more, quote, desperate slave markets and labeled as refuse Bight slaves by skeptical purchasers. only a final entry of the, quote, quick sale in Nevis, about 1 week after the Jameses' arrival there, hints at the destruction of the lives on board. On Thursday, June 22nd, 1676, after at least 9 months' captivity on board a slave ship, Captain Blake writes of the last Africans to disembark as casually as the weather, quote, "This morning we sold all the slaves, 19 being very bad were carried ashore. 18 of them were sold for 1,000 pounds of sugar per head, and one, which was a mad wench, sold for 1,400 pounds of sugar. Also in the morning aboard, 20 refuse slaves were sold at 1,700 pounds of sugar per head. These 24 hours, I have had the wind at east and by south and at east-northeast. 9 more captives, 8 women and 1 man, died during the week it took to complete the Nevis sale. Though we catch a glimpse of a captive woman whose condition of madness marks a troubling individuality among the otherwise anonymous cargo, the 20 refuse slaves disappear in the price of sugar paid for these expiring lives. The captives deemed refuse leave the ship nameless and enumerated. 7 men and 10 women, 2 of them dead and 2 more will not live. 11 and 7 that died before sold any, and several since. These numbered bodies make up the discarded lives of the slave trade. Their ultimate fate remains invisible to the archive, precisely due to their declining condition and their devaluation to the captain, traders, and merchants seeking to maximize profit in the sale of these human captives. This talk explores the liminal lives and unaccountable deaths of the so-called refuse slaves, the people who survived the Middle Passage but died or were sometimes sold at a discount to planters and merchants looking for a bargain in this flesh market. These sick and dying people remain as fleeting mentions in the histories of the Atlantic slave trade. Every colonial language of the Atlantic world has a name for them. Del Desecho, Macron, Menelia Prof, refuse slave, creating a transcolonial and universally recognized relationship between blackness and expendability. My focus on these dying captives allows us to explore 17th and 18th century constructions of humanity, Atlantic ports as spaces of death and immobility for captives, and the historical origins of the disposability of black life. Moreover, it brings into focus the limits of historical methodologies when contemplating human life so devalued that after accounting for them, they disappear into the archives as they do in coastal waters or unmarked graves. As Michel Rolfe-Trouillot argues, the materiality of the socio-historical process, what he terms historicity 1, sets the stage for future historical narratives, or historicity 2. In other words, the slave trade archives, which turn humans into commodities, numbers, profits, and debits, make the project of writing histories of the discarded lives that much more difficult due to the statistical and abstracted form by which they emerge in the archive. The slave ship James has caught the attention of scholars studying the transatlantic slave trade for the quality and length of Captain Peter Blake's journal of the voyage from the Gold Coast to Barbados and then on to Nevis. Historian Greg O'Malley follows the James to remark upon the significance of the intercolonial slave trade between the Caribbean islands and the North American colonies. The James's voyage, as O'Malley points out, presents an example of how the smaller slave markets, such as Nevis, became primary sites for undesirable captives, as well as one of the many instances when captives did not disembark in their first point of entry into the Americas. Another historian, Stephanie Smallwood, also spends considerable time in Winneba, Anamago, and other Gold Coast trading posts where the James collected captives for several months, beginning on August 28, 1675, before the Atlantic crossing that ended the first leg of his journey at least 9 months later. To stress this point, there had been captives aboard the slave ship at least 9 months before reaching Bridgetown. Smallwood methodically follows the James and Captain Blake as he negotiates with various traders and gives an accounting of the, quote, temporal and spatial realities of African captives' transatlantic voyages. She argues, quote, putting the statistician's numbers back into the context in which death occurred. In this work, I follow her lead to attend to the lives and deaths of the captives in the midst of their abstracted and insouciant representations. But I push beyond context to elaborate on what it meant to exist in human liminality, in transition from commodity to death. There are many other archival accounts of captives, judged refuse slaves, to be found throughout the vast record-keeping of traders, planters, and merchants. Some references appear in the slave trade abolition debates of the late 18th century that offer us another moment to think about the relationship between the archive and historical production. A single person, a captive on board a ship, may emerge to signify the horrors of the trade to the British Parliament. This signification, their death as an example, becomes the single moment they emerge historically, and they vanish just as quickly. They are ephemeral archival traces. They were not meant for history. Mr. Arnold, a ship's surgeon, testified to the Privy Council that while on board a ship called the Ruby, and while lying at Bimbe on the West African coast, quote, a woman was one day brought to us to be sold. She came with a child in her arms. The captain refused to purchase her on that account, not wishing to be plagued with a child on board. In consequence of this, she was taken back to shore. On the following morning, however, she was again brought to us, but without the child, and she was apparently in great sorrow. The black trader who brought her on board informed Mr. Arnold that the child had been killed in the night to accommodate us in the sale. The category of the discarded and disposable also extends to the unusable. In this case, a child whose presence on board a ship would mean extra energy, care, and risk of death. Calculations of value and non-value were made on both sides of the Atlantic, from the African littoral to American ports. A child is turned into a plague. The mother's sorrow here becomes unreliable historical material. How do we historicize grief and the magnitude of her loss? Could this be a source of a captive female's madness on the other side of the Atlantic world? What ethical calculations did the trader contemplate in the decision to kill a child? What are the ethics of the slave trade? At stake here, beyond archival limitation, is also an initial attempt to locate the people lost in a system of human commodification in order to understand how the negation of their human status was initiated in the first iterations of slave production and early modern capitalism. On another voyage between 1786 and 1787, a young boy on the slave ship the Little Pearl, docked in St. Vincent, was so weak and emaciated that the first mate informed the surgeon he was dying very fast. He could have been in any American port, from Bridgetown to Charleston to Williamstad. The stories from the slave trade repeat such scenes of death. Mr. Arnold, here on a different ship, and the first mate debated what to do with the boy. The mate insisted that the boy should remain hidden because, quote, he would diminish the average price of the cargo. The mate was anticipating profit from the sale of the rest of the captives. While arguing over whether to, quote, dispatch the boy with poison or drown him, actually tying bricks to his feet, the boy remained locked in the men's hold without any food or water. The unnamed boy, like the infant and the captives carried off the James, were part of a complex of capital investment that relied on their ability to labor. The mate's expected profit was premised on the capacity of the boy's productivity, or in Marxist terms, his labor power. But as the boy descended into death, his productive energy waned, his value and profitability declined, and the return on the mate's investment declined with him. If we think about the transatlantic slave trade as a mode of slave production, a market that produced bodies for labor, then we must attend to the humans that were turned into waste from this same mode of production. The African boy on the Little Pearl died after spending 9 days in the ship's hold while in port without food or water. He, like the hundreds of thousands of others in a deadly condition, become the, quote, byproduct of capitalist industry, the detritus of slave production. African life became disposable when no longer valuable as productive or energetic labor. The slave traders anticipated these so-called refuse slaves. Indeed, they classified them, a calculation that determined how many captives merchants could afford to lose in the pursuit of profit at the end of the slave trading route. There has been, since Eric Williams' seminal book, 1944, Capitalism and Slavery, great interest in indexing the ways in which enslaved labor literally fueled the rise of the West. Most recently, historians Walter Johnson, Edward Baptist, and Sven Beckert grapple with the local to global reach of cotton markets in the antebellum Mississippi Valley, the energy, reproduction, and destruction of enslaved bodies necessary to sustain such markets, and slavery as a system and market imbricated in and as a constituent aspect of modern capitalism. Cedric Robinson's exemplary and foundational text, Black Marxism, The Making of the Black Radical Tradition, mentioned yesterday by Professor Roberts, was revisited in a recent issue of the Boston Review, wherein scholars centered the slave trade in the making of capitalism and not, as Marx would place it, quote, in capitalism's prehistory of primitive accumulation. Theories of racial capitalism inhere on a laboring, living, productive, racialized body. But what does it mean to die as a byproduct of the slave trade? How does the so-called refuse slaves complicate the relationship between capitalism and slavery? Looking closer at the machinations of slave trade production, we understand that by packing ships beyond capacity, or not adequately provisioning the ships, created life-threatening conditions for the captives on board. The investing merchants, including the banking, stock, and insurance industries, which arose from this human trade, and those employed on board the ships and in American ports, could turn Africans into waste despite their desire for maximum return. This is the overproduction of the slave trade. Ship captains and crews often decided who would die and by what method, at the same time attempting to prevent too much human waste in the process. Understanding this might articulate the concentration of power in the agents of the trade, but fails to fully delineate the condition of each captive life that ended at the point of unsellability. We must still search for the language and the analytical tools to describe the effects of this process on captive lives. It is a matter of language and sustained attention. It is ethical work. There are other theoretical frameworks analyzing the ontological condition of enslaved people. Since Orlando Patterson's classic book on the topic in the early 1980s, scholars have written about the condition of the slave as human, object, and property through the concept of social death. I won't rehearse that literature here, except to note that some have been critical of how that paradigm of social death too completely stands in for the experience of enslavement. And these scholars are arguing that it doesn't account for the ways in which people have agency and can resist the predicament of slavery, not the condition. More recently, scholars have taken up Giorgio Agamben's concept of bare life to think more completely through racialization and precarity. Agamben's concept centered on the violence of the Holocaust, and specifically on the figure of the Musliman, or Muslimaners, translated as Muslim, which was a slang term for Jewish prisoners who lingered in a state in between life and death and starvation in the Nazi concentration camps. Through a description of the Musliman, Agamben offers a language that brings us close to, but is yet not sufficient enough for, articulating the condition of the refused as, quote, a bare, unassigned, and unwitnessable life, the body stripped of all personality, deprived of power, life, sense, and soul, constructing a new category for people who were slipping into a state of being non-human. Taking the concept of bare life further, Elizabeth Maddock Dillon refines Agamben, aiming the from those laboring bodies or it subjugated. Yet Dillon's definition relies on a productive body, not on the refused descending into death, whose liminal status in between life and death, commodity and waste, trapped on a slave ship, was neither laboring slave nor statically commodified. Scholarly analysis of historical moments of mass human death often turn to understanding Foucault's notion of biopolitics. And I'm going through, I'm rehearsing some of this literature to show how it fails to account for the condition of the refused. So to turn to understanding Foucault's notion of biopolitics, quote, the domain of life over which power has taken control. Extending this into a discussion to racialize people subjected to and by power over their life and death, Achille Mbembe tells us that biopolitics also encompasses the understanding of, quote, sovereignty whose central project is not the struggle for autonomy, but the generalized instrumentalization of human existence and the material destruction of human bodies and populations, what he has termed necropolitics. Alexander Weheliye's aforementioned book, Habeas Viscus, offers a succinct summation of Foucault and Agamben's philosophical contributions to ontological dimensions of the human forced into proximity to death. Both Foucault and Agamben, Weheliye argues, offer the concepts of biopolitics and bare life viewed through the Holocaust to reveal human degradation in its most extreme form. For Agamben, the Musliman transcended race at the threshold of humanity, and his condition becomes the prism through which human ethics and morality must be understood. He states that this figure shows, quote, another way of being human at the limits and most extreme form of life. For Foucault, the biopolitics expressed through the Holocaust's deathly terror is the moment and location where racism becomes conceptually relevant, and when, quote, the full reach of biopower is expressed. Ultimately, Weheliye argues that both scholars fail to acknowledge the antecedents of annihilating racial exclusion and terror in slavery and colonialism. I briefly and partially engaged these theorists in my initial meditations on the refused slave to agree with Weheliye's critiques of philosophical meditations on power and racial terror that exclude and erase the violent assemblages of slavery and colonialism. But I would suggest that the critique offers no specificity that helps us think through the range of conditions to which enslaved people were subjected, nor does he deconstruct the technologies, calculi, and bio or necropolitical formation of slavery and blackness on which states consolidated power. He also does not fully elaborate on the logics of black disposability, originating from the slave trade that have been reproduced in different forms in our modern world, like mass incarceration or unredressed murder of black people by the police. Attentive to the limits of the slave trade's archive of profits and debits that commodified African captives, I am interested in thinking about both the condition of the captives who were dying and refused by the production of the slave trade, as well as expounding on the philosophical, structural, and violent technologies necessary for captains, traders, merchants, agents, and buyers to willfully participate in the destruction of lives. I ask what theories of the human emerge if we spend time in these archives of the slave trade, on the actual bodies that perished in the warehouses, pens, and in the hold, and on modernity's destructive effect on African lives at the beginning of conceptualizations of race and human disposability. Abolitionist and naval officer Reverend James Ramsay sent an essay to the Privy Council of the British Parliament during the debates to end the slave trade in the late 1780s. Ramsay wrote about how African captives who were unsellable were discarded. He explains the proportion of refuse slaves depends upon the size of the ship, the length of the passage, and the breaking out of any epidemic disorder among them. In general, a very considerable number set aside as refuse might be seen at the sales. Perhaps 1 in 3 may recover, but in others almost all die before they become useful. At the sales, they appear naked, emaciated, some unable to stand, and some are too ill to be brought on shore. This concept of usefulness exemplifies one of the many violent and ethical problems with this early capitalist economy, one that did not ensure freedom in free market exchange, but rather produced and depended upon slavery, precarity, and the production of humans as waste. The term refuse connotes both waste and refusal. The women, infants, children, and men were refused by the traders as not profitable based on their emaciation, illness, debility, and mental state. They were accused of melancholia, madness, dejection, and disease. Some died before they boarded ships on the West African coasts, and others languished in the ports of the Atlantic world. They existed in human limbo, neither slaves nor human, and within different conceptions of death, social, civil, civic, figurative, and literal. Their value extinguished, they bore the stigma of the decommodified. For Stephanie Smallwood, the process by which humans became chattel started at the littoral, the coast of West Africa, and continued through the Middle Passage. This method included being shackled in fetters, deprived of control over food intake, and the calculations made on how much sustenance, space, and air was necessary to prevent captives' deaths. Speaking of the economic machinations of the slave trading littoral, Smallwood argues, quote, "The violence exercised in the service of human commodification relied on a scientific empiricism, always seeking to find the limits of human capacity for suffering, the point where material and social poverty threatened to consume entirely the lives it was meant to garner for sale in the Americas." Here Smallwood poignantly articulates the necropolitics of the slave trade. She continues, "The economic enterprise of human trafficking marked a watershed in what would become an enduring project in the modern Western world, probing the limits up to which it is possible to discipline the body without extinguishing the life within." Theoretically, then, the process of decommodification, of deciding a body has passed the limits of possibility, which drew from similar if opposite calculi and technologies, might work to rehumanize the captives from unsellable commodity back to human. Yet the layered processes of the slave trade that rendered humans into capital, commodity, and on the other side waste, did not relieve or restore people caught in the system of flesh traffic. On the contrary, in this instance, the opposite of commodification is not freedom or humanity, but rather death and disposal. The horrors of freedom materialize in bodily degradation and a particular kind of suffering. The captive Africans categorized as refuse evade historical articulation because their lives are fleeting, fragmented, and they're mentioned only in the loss they create. They reside in a column of debits on a ship's ledger. They cannot fit our historiographical debates or desires for examples of resistance, or to help us understand how people made lives, built communities, and survived under the violent conditions of slavery. The category of refuse represents the impossibilities of life under such conditions, and the dying captives themselves refuse our desire for empirical material with which to narrate such experiences. I'm interested in understanding the power, authority, and structures of violence that European colonists deployed to make African captives live, to be commodified, or make them die. What do we make of this figure that has eluded the historiography? Why follow the dead and the dying? One way to attend to the disposable lives of the slave trade is to consider the temporality of their last moments in life, as they waited or lingered in the hold or the pens on shore, and their significance to modernity in the productions of their deaths. Second, accounting for the lives lost at the end of the slave trading voyages also provides us several pathways to ponder the status and value of the category human in the early modern Atlantic world. Third, following the deaths of African captives upon arrival in American ports expands the work of scholars interested in the relationships between capitalism and slavery, yet it also confounds that scholarship's reliance on laboring and able bodies. This is an argument that not only were systems of slavery and the slave trade complex and capitalist in nature, but production did not always yield productivity. Fourth, the majority of philosophical scholarship, including Foucault and Agamben, on the mass destruction of human life and mass destruction and liminality of human life focuses on the 20th century, as I pointed out. If we start in the early modern Atlantic, our discussion of human conditions, racial hierarchies, and power reveal the continuum of human precarity, not the exception. From European conquest of peoples and lands in the Americas to our present. This attention to the elusive historical lives of refused captives may also illuminate the origins of Black disposability that can be historicized in most early modern and modern periods. Finally, this effort to attend to the most impossible historical subjects is to continue to expose the limits and functions of historical methods that require a vast base of empirical material. Refuse slaves appeared in every ship logbook and in financial records of the trade across the Atlantic. In one way, there is an abundance of material from which to draw and contextualize. However, the anonymity of the captives, their violent deaths, and their brief and fragmented mentions fail to generate the kind of narratives historians rely on to sustain a significant study. Returning to Trujillo, how do we recognize the end of a bottomless silence? Persisting in this project, despite the devastating limitations of this archive, seeks to subvert archival power and the erasure of enslaved subjects, impossible to retrieve using documents produced in a slave society limited by capitalist and elite perspectives. It is to engage in an ethical scholarly practice that attends to the most vulnerable, and to quote Christina Sharp, in the wake of history. Thank you.
So Marissa will be happy to take questions.
And I'm happy to answer questions about Dispossessed Lives as well, because I know that there are several of you that have just recently read it.
Thank you so much for that really engaging lecture. I have a question about something that I don't think counts under refugee slaves, but seems to be similar. So in Jim Crow, there are often, and under slavery too, there often was this category of a bad person or a crazy person, where bad was somebody who was a bad example for other black people who would maybe make them run away or make them disobey. And were often disposed of through extreme punishment as an example.
Okay.
And similarly with the quote-unquote crazy, those were people who challenged white people directly. And so again, would be almost like a disease that would catch on, needed to be made an example of to prevent that disease of resistance, and violent resistance often, from continuing. So I wonder how that fits into what you're using as this category of refuse, since it's not about being physically weak or near death, but rather undermining the whole system of power, but also being then disposed of.
So thank you for that. I think you point to the spectrum of the condition of an enslaved person, or a person existing in the afterlife of slavery, where the destruction of black life still kind of animates social functions. But I would say I'm specifically interested in commodification. And I haven't theorized it beyond, this initial moment, because I think post-slavery something changes. And it's not that the significance of laboring bodies to capitalist production in the US in the Jim Crow context is not at play, but there is something specific about deciding that, and this is very specific to the slave trade, deciding a body is a body and no longer valuable, and literally discarding them. That is different from punishing and confining in the way that you're talking about. I think I want to mark a kind of historical change or difference in thinking about, but it also elaborates on how those structures that originated in the slave trade moment are reproduced and morphed into different ways to control black life and black bodies.
Awesome. Thank you so much for this really rich work here. My mind is going in a number of directions, so hopefully this comes out somewhat legible. Your work here, especially thinking about refuse and refusal, makes me think of Katrina Deon Thompson's work, Ring Shout Will About, where one of the chapters she writes about is titled Casting, where she's using records from a trial where a captain is on trial for having disposed of a captive, young girl enslaved from the ship, and his reason is because she was sullied, right? Mm-hmm. But she was sullied, as Deon Thompson unpacks, because the records also show the ways in which the captives, one, were forced, as you're talking about now in the middle passage, to, for their own selves, they were forced to dance in shackles, but also for their own sort of physical development, but also for the entertainment of the captains and the crew members, who also used that sort of method of turning their movement into a commodified form for them to also objectify them,
yes,
also sexually. Yes. So apparently this captive girl was also refusing these advances, even though she was being sexually abused over time. So she was thrown over the ship because also she was creating an issue for the rest of the crew, right? So I wonder, she maybe she would have made it, right, and would have fit into the other, would have made it to the next destination. And I'm wondering if that puts her in this category of refuse, if she would have made it, but then if she then becomes discarded because she's thrown over the ship by the captain, who determined that her body is no longer useful to him because it's actually proposing a refusal in a certain way, right? So I don't know if that makes any sense, but I'm wondering how that works there.
It does. It's pushing me to think about how does one hold on to a captive body, but while also elaborating the category, right? Those are two different things that come in contact with each other and are imbricated, but also kind of, this category is more expansive and encompasses a range of people that aren't sick and dying like the infant, or like someone who becomes unuseful to the project of order on a slave ship, period, right? So I would say that the category is expansive enough to kind of accommodate all of these different modes of refusing and refusal and being refused, yet the body, the captive body that is marked as refuse is about a particular configuration of capitalist calculation. Yeah, I would say there's a imbrication, but also a separation.
Thank you so much. I'm nervous. I'm reading this question that I wrote down. So at present, I'm working on a gender and sexuality studies honors thesis that relies really heavily on Black literary theory. And as such, I've been thinking a lot about the intersections between Africana studies and gender and sexuality studies. And as a person who has at least a foot in both disciplines, I'm wondering if you can talk to us about your experience of teaching those simultaneously and provide any methodologies you think have been really fruitful, as I'm hoping to kind of braid those disciplines together more so at this institution.
Okay, thank you for that. Actually, so I just taught a class at the graduate level on gender in the archive. And I did this not that we were only focusing on gender as a category, but to think about how historical work is produced about vulnerable historical subjects generally, right? But I brought women's and gender studies PhD students together with history PhD students, not for the first time, but for the first time purposefully, so that they could have an existential crisis the whole semester about them serious. I sat back and giggled the whole time because the historians were they're coming in first year students. I know what historical methodology is. I know you need evidence. I know the evidence says this thing. And then the WGS students, or I had one from Complet who kept explaining, all history is fiction and all fiction is history, and to the delight of me, of watching the students work out what are my assumptions about discipline? What are the tools that I need to analyze particular subjects? And I think that's one of the things I do in my book, is argue for historians to say, you may press me about me making generalized exclamations about the condition of enslaved female life in Bridgetown, but if you ask me to find more records about people who didn't leave them, you're actually participating in a kind of violence. And so that, being able to say that is drawn from the work of Saidiya Hartman and all these others that think about the archive, and Savtruyo and Silences, that theorize and that philosophize about discipline and disciplining and methodology in a particular way. So it's really, who are your subjects, and what are the best tools that you could use to make that project a reality, or to really understand their perspective most fully.
Hello. So you use the word decommodification when talking about refuge lives. I was wondering what makes the commodification of death any different than the commodification of the living?
That's a great question. So both processes, both calculations are emerging from a similar mode of production, right? It is this slave trade, it is producing bodies for labor, and then it is the extension of that on the plantations where they're laboring. So traders and planters and all along this chain are making decisions based on a body's value, right? They're commodifying them, they're putting a price on them. And Smallwood, for us, kind of breaks down that process to its most minute forms. How do you turn a human being into a commodity? Well, you take away their ability to feed themselves. You confine them. You put them in shackles, right? There's all these ways that you put the body through a process of becoming commodified. What I'm arguing about decommodification, and again, for my audience, this is a brand new project that I'm still working out the fine-tuning of what I mean when I say things. What I'm thinking about is that there's a different calculation, there are different processes, maybe similar technologies, but different processes that the merchants and traders are thinking about to deem a body that unusable and refuse. That's the decommodification. And if you're decommodified, you are susceptible to, especially at the end of a slave trading route, to be left to die in a slave pen. And I should say, like, why I started thinking about this in the first place, and I encourage all of you that are doing theses work and all of that to back up your archival material, first of all. Because I came across a scrap in the process of researching my first book, and it was a poor white man who was petitioning the Barbados Council for reimbursement because he had spent the last 4 days feeding a captive in a warehouse, a female captive, who died. So I thought, oh my God, 4 days of time goes by, and that's also why I stress we need to think about this time that we never ever consider when people are sitting in port for weeks, and what happens to you when that happens. But I thought about what her final moments were, what she thought about, who came in to see her, what happened to her when this man came in to see her. Why would he feed her if she was considered, disposable? So that is how I sort of came to the project. I have since lost that fragment. I don't know where it is. But it made me think about temporality, decommodification, devalue, and death. Not death on a plantation, but death before you even get to a plantation.
Thank you. As you know, there are historians who have been rather invested in quantifying the transatlantic slave trade and the numbers of captives who embarked and disembarked and all of that. So I'm wondering if, when we add this category of refuse slaves, and it sounds as if it's a category that should be added at every step, how does that change what we think we know about the numbers of African captives who were forced to make this voyage, who survived this voyage, etc.?
Mm-hmm.
And the second question is, how do refugee slaves play into things like insurance policies?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you. So, several things, but I'll try to be brief. The numbers, people, I'll say the numbers, guys. They're still alive and well. And even as there's all this new wonderful work that critiques how that numbers work, simply reproduces the archive of making the captives abstract, and we lose the human in that process. Even as there's all this wonderful work called Accounting for the Slave Trade, Jennifer Morgan, it's coming out in the next year, her new book project, that pushes back on all of that quantifying effort. But I would say that the databases proliferate And there's, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the slave trade database, right, that came out of David Blight, then it went to Harvard, and well, there's 2.2 and 0.3 versions of them that they're still invested in doing a kind of counting. But that counting doesn't include these people. And for me, it's a way to continue to push back on the abstraction. Because to what end do you count how many captives you can count that were transported that disembarked? To what end for us is that project useful? When I want to also understand how many people died, not how many people died, but that people died, many more will forever be unaccountable to us, or uncountable to us, that are as important as those final numbers. So this is a way to kind of try to gesture towards illuminating that aspect of this trade, from the march in the hinterlands to the end of the journey. So when you bring up insurance, I think of the Zong. And so many of us are familiar with this case. 1760s, there was a ship called the Zong with 300 plus captives on board. Some of them died from all of the things that I talked about, of just malnutrition and all of that. But at a point where the captain claims they ran out of water, even though they were really close to Jamaica, the captain and crew decide to dump 133 very well alive people overboard to collect insurance on them. So I'm going to have to contend with, and I'm thinking through, what does it mean? Are they refuse? They're not refuse. They're not categorized as refuse in the same way as these folks are. They are in a state of commodity that makes it possible for them to be thrown overboard. And the decisions that were made in the case, right? The judge says this would be as if you threw wood over the ship, right? This is just one product of many. And I can't remember, they decided for the insurance that they didn't have to give money to the owners of the ship, right? Because this was a fight over insurance money and not the murder of 133 people. But it's a different calculation than is being made, I think, in this moment of you can't be sold at all. And you're now a surplus because I don't know what to do with you because we're at port. What happens to these bodies? What happens to the people? Where do they go? We don't have a record of that. We don't know where they're buried. They're certainly not dumped into the harbor because the townspeople would complain of an environmental hazard, right? So I'm looking for burial grounds. The Royal Africa Company in Bridgetown had its own burial ground. It had its own slave pens and warehouses. I'm trying to think through those spaces as well.
Imagine speaking.
One person in front of you.
Hello.
Oh, okay.
As you're speaking, and as I'm just really reflecting on these past 2 days about slavery bounds in the archive, and about how you're talking about 133 bodies that were just discarded, and those were human lives and whatnot. A question that I'd just like to pose: how do you take care of yourself throughout the emotional labor of this process? And this involves, the many scholars and the many students who are doing research involving. So.
Yeah, thank you. This is not the first time I've heard this question, and it remains a difficult question to answer. I don't know that I will ever be able to do it without being unscathed by and sitting with this particular archive. And I actually thought the last book was hard in that regard, like the violence but this is another whole thing, right? But I manage the emotion when I'm presenting, but I'm sitting with it by myself when I'm writing it. I think about this as trauma work. Like, I think about the folks that do trauma surgery, or work in trauma environments that do it every single day. They go to work and they try to attend to human trauma. I was not trained to do that. And I cannot do that. I know I can't. But I can do this. That is what I can do. And it's part of, I think, part of the wake work that Madi brought up with Christina Sharp. It's part of the care work that is necessary to continue to attend to the trauma that Black people face. I have to step away. You have to step away in order to kind of regroup over the course of a project. I'm only beginning, so I'm developing methods, but it's also being in community and getting energy from folks who this is important work for, right? So thank you for that question.
You all know the answer to this question. I'm curious about the word that you used several times, bare. What do you mean by bare? It's B-A-R-E.
Yeah.
Are you speaking just naked?
I'm going to actually ask Professor Roberts, the political philosopher in this regard. Can you help me explain bare life? Because it's eros and something else, and I'm just trying to grapple with it.
Giorgio Agamben is an Italian philosopher that the book that was referenced by Alexander Wahale uses his work. And so in English, there's been a couple of translations. So Agamben has talked about the idea of the distinction between what he called sovereign power and bare life. But you can actually translate the Italian word as also naked life, so it's the similar. But in terms of in ancient Greek, there's two different notions for life. There's life that's literally just kind of your kind of at the kind of purely biological level, and then in the kind of the physical science is something that we associate with zoology, or what we call zoe. There's a different conception of life, and so Agamben was trying to think about, as was presented in this really brilliant lecture for us today, about the idea of what does it mean for individuals who are in concentration camps who have been reduced to, whether it's not nakedness in terms of what's on us, are we naked, do we have clothes or not, but at the most kind of reduced to the most kind of suppressed and oppressed in the most kind of bare, right, level, at the most at that most extreme level. And then what does that say about the ability of what Sheila Mbembe calls about necropolitics? What does it mean for individuals to have the ability to decide who lives, right, and who dies, who gets euthanized, right, and who doesn't? And that's my sense, but I'm probably missing some things. I don't know, but it seems like that was the kind of tenor of that particular, I guess, use of it. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Can I actually ask my question? So I realized I have a question that is, I thought this was related to the project, but it actually connects to things that came up, which is, you're giving us an account of how to think about the refugee slaves, and I'm realizing now I did not realize the distinction, but it seems like an implication of your project is actually pushing us to recategorize how we think about commodification. And so what I thought my question was going to be is, I don't know about the rest of you, but I've been fascinated / troubled by the discourse around college basketball player Zion Williamson.
That's right.
So Zion Williamson is a Duke University freshman, who many have said, well, if right now could go to be the number one, in the next NBA draft. The latest game, correct me if I'm wrong, but the game recently against Duke University men's team and North Carolina, the average ticket seat was almost $3,000. I believe it was 29 average. I believe the highest seats went up for upwards of $10,500. Seats this size, right? President Obama was at this game. Jay-Z, a whole bunch of stars have been going. 36 or 38 seconds into the game, wearing a Nike, speaking of branding, a Nike shoe, Zion Williamson, he just makes a shift, not even a big shift, falls on the ground, the shoe breaks open, right? $200-something shoe breaks open, and immediately ESPN, all these global networks are then talking about, oh, we thought he was going to go for top in the draft. Is he still going to go? In other words, what is his value? Mm-hmm. This is a 267-pound teen black man who has been reduced, speaking of reduction, to his use value, right? Mm-hmm. Or potentially, when I was listening to your talk, I was thinking, and we have to be careful, right, not to collapse slavery and a slave in terms of someone who's playing that, but nonetheless, there was this way in which I wondered, it seems like it's a mild sprain, but let's say the MRI came back and it said he tore his ACL. I was thinking how many people had just decided who's disposed, like, right? Yeah. That not only is he not going number one, maybe he might not even come back for Duke in the next year. Maybe he might not even graduate from a college. And that's what actually was going through my mind, because we already know examples, unfortunately, of people who are hyped up and then something happened, and then not only did they not go to the NBA, but they aren't even talked about at all. So this is to say, is I realize this is not your book project, but I'm just curious if you could comment on the, not only how do we think, maybe these make some gradations of how do we think about commodification, but that might also mean how do we think about different understandings of of disposability. I mean, what really struck me was kind of when Mike Brown and his body, it wasn't that Michael Brown was the first kind of black youth, and we can talk about the circumstances of his death. It was the idea that his body was laying in the street with officers and people just walking around like they were going like, oh, when's your next class? Oh, 2 o'clock. Oh, we're going to go to the snack. And people just walking back and forth right around his dead body is laying in the street, right? And I wonder, what is, that we become desensitized. I mean, we can't, but just in general, this kind of orgy of violence that we can kind of then become desensitized between what's valued, I mean, I wondered with that, what if Mike Brown happened to be a well-known player like Zion Williamson? Would it have been, oh, it's sad he's in the street, or, oh, his use value is gone now, he's dead, right? He's no use to the market. So that might have been scattered. The general idea of disposability and commodity, even if that's not simply about the refugee slave, but just how do we, kind of think about this? Without making too much collapsing.
So for me, it's not about the collapsing. It's about this project being able to really, and I can't do it in this, but really try to figure out how to map and how to articulate the invention of race, blackness. This is the moment when blackness and whiteness are created, right? The slave trade, slavery. At the same time as capitalism is beginning, and forever linking the possibility that black bodies can forever be disposable and expendable. That the value has been so negated that they are, and the reason why I say, like, I'm a historian, and I am a historian, that's weird, that does philosophy and whatever, or tries to, but it's understanding that this is the originary moment of what you're talking about. Capitalism has always ever been about the commodification of black bodies. And what I'm showing also, it is also the decommodification and waste production of black bodies. And I think that is a structure and technology that has been reproduced not just in the United States, but the whole world over. And that Mr. Franklin had showed sort of the span of. And that's why I showed the language, the word disposable refuse slave that has been created in every language of the colonial trading world in slave trade, means that every European and many of these polities involved in this trade thought about black people that way. That's a hard thing to undo. And I don't know that this is just it's this kind of point to kind of get us to dwell on that in its originary formation, and to draw from it what we think about. And again, I want to say too, like one could argue, there are populations of people all over the world that are disposable because of capitalism. This articulation of this originary moment allows us to have a framework to talk about them as well.
Thank you. Is this on still?
No, testing. Thank you so much for this brilliant talk. I have a couple of observations followed by something of a mischievous question that I'm hoping you'll indulge. Right? So I understand Oilia's Hagus Viscus to be a project about thinking about what modes or modalities of resistance become possible in the absence of full human agency, right? And so I'm thinking at least about one of the other folks that you mentioned in your talk, and someone who you didn't mention in your talk that I know also animates your thinking. So I'm thinking about the end of Spiller's Mama's Baby, when she talks about what it might mean to claim the monstrosity. I'm also thinking about Fred's talk at MoMA on blackness and non-performance, where he talks about the practice of self-refusal. Oftentimes he'll say he's just putting a theoretical formulation on something Fannie Lou Hamer used to say, which is to refuse that which has been refused you. I'm wondering what the archive tells us about the practice of self-refusal, or what it might mean to actually claim the monstrosity of the category of the refuse slave. So I don't know if self-emaciation is a practice of resistance we want to think about, but I'm wondering what even slave narratives might tell us about how enslaved communities were thinking about these categories, and what it might mean to actually have, like, embrace the category, right? And I don't know if this is making much sense, but self-refusal, right? Or what it might mean for slaves, right, or enslaved peoples during the Middle Passage, right? To think about the second meaning of refuse, right? And to kind of embrace that monstrosity, right? Like, what does it mean to, like, sort of then, I mean, almost take one's own life, right? Like, is that something that we find in the archive? So,
yeah.
Hopefully you'll indulge that.
That's hard. That's really hard because I tend to kind of veer away from reading resistance into many different things about slavery. I mean, in that I struggle with it as a concept of an analytic concept on slavery. I understand how and why it's necessary after being in this archive and after knowing Dispossessed Lives. I'm like, oh, so no wonder we talk about resistance. We need that. We need hope. We do. And so I generously take your question to think about the archival evidence of captives refusing food. They did. Of refusing to move, of refusing to dance, of refusing all of the things that is being demanded of them on a ship. And that was all possible and true. But, and again, I'm not an Afro-pessimist, but I'm also thinking about, like, the ones that didn't, that were subjected by and to these powerful forces. I don't know what it means to embrace something that is so destructive. I haven't gotten there yet. Maybe by the end of this book I will, but I haven't. I sort of have a visceral trigger, but because it's a productive and difficult question for me. And to Spiller's, I mean, that's why, I left, this talk would have been 3 hours if I included her and Winter, but I mean, they're the ones that I really going to really sit with for a long time to think about the human and to think about what the flesh, theorizing the flesh allows for us in this configuration. But I almost want to turn it back to you. What do you think it does to embrace
the monstrosity
of
the category of the refuse?
Yeah.
Right, I'm just thinking it could.
Because I know. I refuse to embrace the condition of how they put these captives in that position. I'm being unarticulate because I'm struggling with this, but
I mean, I'm just interested also in some of the case studies of slaves that sort of refuse, right, the desire for subjectivity or life, right, and how this becomes central to sort of Moten's current projects, right? And so I'm just thinking, could decommodification also be self-refusal?
Yes. I mean, there are. I have to rethink Moten in that regard. Is he talking specifically about slavery?
Yes.
Okay. So maybe I need to read it again. Although I understand him to be a poet, so every other word I understand of him. But I'll read it. Absolutely. There's a Terry Snyder just wrote a book about slave suicide. An entire book about instances of enslaved suicide. So then we have to theorize if death is really death or not. Is it freedom? Mm-hmm. And does freedom mean free? And so, thanks for upending my whole project.
Very quickly, because it's already 3:30, in reference to the comparison of Williamson, the commodification of Williamson and the commodification of the refuse slaves, I wonder if there isn't a difference between commodification and dehumanization, because Williamson still has a choice, or had a choice, assuming he can still play. He has not been dehumanized because he's been commodified. Okay, is there no difference between? But then you bring up this question of the people who are refuse slaves actually having a choice, choosing as a form of perhaps suicide, which simply really complicates the question: are they acting out of choice or not? Because I assume that they aren't. Whereas in the case of Williamson, he has a choice. He is not dehumanized. He is commodified, but not dehumanized. Isn't there a distinction made there?
Yeah. No, I think that's a really important point of pointing out a difference between systems of power in slavery and systems of power operation now, and how capitalism changes to adjust to those things. But that there is a process of dehumanization involved in this slave trade commodification process. It's to take the human. When I say this, I'm also not saying that enslaved people were not human. Like I never want to assert that at all. I'm sort of talking about it on a theoretical level of what is happening to the kind of discursive production around and the objectification of what this discourse allows. Who was talking about this yesterday or today? Somebody, were you talking about this, Marvel? Yeah. So, like, what discourse of valuelessness allows in terms of human behavior, right? So that absolutely comes into it to think about historical differences. And, Thank you.
So again, another big round of applause for Dr. Pointers.